Welcome everyone to my lecture on the eternal recurrence of the same as the greatest or heaviest weight. I will here discuss some of the ideas about the eternal recurrence of the same or the eternal recurrence of the like, which perhaps is a better translation for die ewige Wiederkehr des Gleichen. I'm going to be referring a lot to the posthumously published notes by Nietzsche. Before I begin, however, please note that I will be teaching a course on Nietzsche starting in October, which will run for 7 weeks, my 4th online course in philosophy this year. It's an original course. There will be 7 full lectures of about an hour or a bit more, and there will be 8 seminars, group seminars, where you can get to meet others and discuss your ideas of the reading. You can also get to write an essay and present a talk. There's a link just down there, so do sign up for updates and or enroll in the course. I will change the links. For now you can get updates on the course and the syllabus if you submit your email address via the link to Helsionic Guild, which is my guild, my group of scholars and thinkers and artists that I founded earlier this year. And yeah, but of course also feel free to support the channel on Patreon and or PayPal, for example, if you so desire. So let me begin now on the eternal recurrence of the same. Here's a quote from Nietzsche. Posthumous men, for example I, are not understood as well as men who reflect their own age, but they are heard with more respect. To be precise, we are never understood, hence our authority. And then here, another quote from Nietzsche with which I would like to begin the essay. 6,000 feet beyond man and time, the eternal recurrence of the same appeared to Nietzsche in a vision. It is a thought of such weight and tragedy, so demanding and nearly ungraspable, that one immediately may want to denigrate it. Someone's reaction upon hearing of the thought of the eternal recurrence for the first time may be one of fear, of endless boredom, as nothing new would ever occur in it. Or one might have a rather moralistic response to it. It seems to be a thought that's even harmful to life, threatening such ideas as progress and improvement and optimization for the sake of optimization. A menace to life, then, the eternal recurrence of the same would be a negation of everything we believe to be observing around us, everything that common sense will hold up as true. Although the eternal recurrence of the same appears to Nietzsche so far beyond man and time, the sole reason why it's revealed to him, of course, are man and the human being's standing or stance in time and in existence with his doctrine, insofar as there is one, or with this thought. Nietzsche demands the most of us human beings. This thought of the eternal recurrence cannot and shall not, must not be explained by common sense. Were common sense ever to become a philosophical argument, philosophy would have come to an end, as Gadamer said. Therefore it is a thought as the eternal recurrence of the same. It is such a doctrine, perhaps, which raises Nietzsche truly to the rank of a philosopher. Because here he demands us to think after being and time. Nietzsche, who was a philologist by training and education, did not have a formal education in philosophy, and he was, for the most part, ignored during his lifetime. The eternal recurrence of the same is, however, a philosophical problem. And I don't mean this in an analytical sense, that it's a problem that needs to be solved or that wants a solution, as Mr. Popper or Sir Popper would have it. When Popper says that all of life is problem solving, this is not here meant by a philosophical problem. I understand this. I want to stress something else. It is a problem in the sense of the original sense of the word, a cliff against which we are striding or striving, and for which we need to find a way to overcome it or to be with it. This problem concerns us, for it asks for nothing less than the origin of the world. And also is supposed to give us a great weight. This question concerns us, even though the question seems to have been answered by the natural sciences, and of course has been accepted by common sense. The Big Bang, for example, which is de facto itself a theological, a quasi-theological theory, which calls the creator God, or the creator spiritus, simply a big explosion in the beginning. The end of the world is then a necessity, a logical necessity, since it moves towards a certain destination. The purpose of the world, if we can still say this, the telos of the world, is to be burned by the imploding sun, millions or billions of years ahead of us. Compared to the biblical apocalypse, this scenario does not really depict a more pleasant picture of the imagination. Rather, it shows the groundless nature of such thinking. It shows nihilism at its core. Nietzsche had certainly understood the nihilistic consequences and tendencies of such theories, for example in the posthumously published notes, in which we will delve into a lot in the course, which are not yet available in English. He saw the nihilistic traits at the heart of the modern natural sciences' view of the world. Out of them stems, he says, nothing but self-destruction. They turn against themselves. Assuming a Big Bang and projecting the end of planet Earth as an apocalyptic telos of hellfire without hell is not only an unovercome Christian moral thinking in disguise, but it is also a deeply life-denying, lebensverneinend, life-negating way of thinking. For it depicts an absolute justification for the meaninglessness of life. Whereas in the Christian morale, there is a day of judgment. There is no such judgment. There is no salvation in the fixtures of the imaginations of the so-called natural sciences, or of this assumption of physics that it must, of course, at some point simply end in fire. If the end of the world is projected in such a way without any higher justifying authority, because God is dead, is valid for Nietzsche, that dictum, then nothing has any weight at all. And that's, for Nietzsche, the situation in which we are. Everything is without telos, without a proper meaning, or sense. For this very reason, Nietzsche proposes the doctrine of the eternal recurrence of the same as the greatest weight. To understand there's an age of Sinnverlust that we're living through with Nietzsche, of the loss of meaning, the loss of sense, the loss of orientation. Nietzsche lives through a time of the loss of meaning. He says, "Is not the 19th century but a century of decadence?" For Nietzsche, decadence is the ambiguity of values. It contains and demands a falling off of meaning, of values, of ideals, which he calls idols. Nietzsche wants to philosophize with a hammer, not to destroy, but precisely to reveal the hollow sound of the idols, which no longer have any grounding, and to show how overcome they are, how hollow they are. Decadence is by no means to be understood in a moralistic sense, i.e. something morally wrong and consequently something that must be fought. Quite the opposite. Nietzsche welcomes it with a great yes, if appropriately lived up to and exercised, as a turning point, a rock bottom and crescendo simultaneously. Kierkegaard was another thinker of the same time who was touched by the Sinnverlust, the loss of sense, the loss of meaning around him. Karl Jaspers revealed his similarities with Nietzsche and both their efforts to initiate a moving away from overcome ideals. Certainly, Kierkegaard focused on Christianity and, in simplified terms, demanded a reformed Christianity that would be closer to man. Nietzsche, on the other hand, would criticize Christianity sharply, amongst other things, for granting man an absolute value. Yet he calls the Übermensch, very importantly, Caesar with the soul of Christ. Nevertheless, also Kierkegaard sees how the idealist perception, the idealistic, not idealist perhaps, but the Platonistic idealistic perception of the world, the platonistically cultivated I, as Nietzsche calls it somewhere, has been shattered and can no longer serve as life-affirming, as life lebensbejahend, as he says in German, which is saying yes to life. It does the yes is already there. So that's no longer a powerful antidote against nihilism, which Nietzsche thought it was. Nihilism, however, he says, is a normal condition. It means the answer to the why is missing. Say it again. Nietzsche says in the posthumously published notebooks, and this is my translation from the German, it's a normal condition. It means the answer to the why is missing. For Jaspers, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are the non-ignorable thinkers of our age. Both of them despise system philosophy. For Kierkegaard, there cannot be a system of existence. And Nietzsche, quote, says, "I distrust all systematizers. The will to a system shows a lack of honesty." The eternal recurrence, then, of the like shall not be understood as a systemic or systematic thought, since a system is but a distraction from reality for Nietzsche. Their thinking created their way of thinking, and I mean Kierkegaard and Nietzsche's way of thinking, created a new atmosphere, one of great openness. The openness they felt and manifested in their writing was grounded in the groundlessness of their time. The groundlessness depicts a threat to man in form of the loss of meaning and decadence. Yet, this is also an opening. Out of this mood, they write, and they are both face the horror vacui, the horror of emptiness. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, then, perhaps should be understood as a chance to say yes to life, a Dionysian yes, which demands all of man's power and capacity for suffering to be appreciated, affirmed, and overturned into creative, active talents. For Nietzsche, the Dionysian human being possesses, quote from Nietzsche, the highest degree of the understanding and answering instinct. Nietzsche is all about drives and instincts. There must be a master drive that can unify all the diverging drives one has within oneself, all the diverging instincts, in order so that there can be a true harmony in the Heraclitean sense. The freed spirit no longer denies. Since the spirit is freed, the free spirit is freed only the individual. So in the whole, the faith that Nietzsche says here, the God here is then the Dionysian God. And that's a God that always says yes. Even when that God denies, it still says yes. And it's the singular here is reprehensible. It's about a unified whole for Nietzsche to a certain degree. Values, that's important, may have been overcome. Ideals may have revealed their void. Yet man still longs for the hereafter, for an ideal world. It is Kierkegaard aesthete, A in either or, who does so, who wants to be where everything is divine, who wants to live in the romantic divine world. The ideal world is the true world for the aesthete. A in either or perceives the worldly world around him as heavy and slow and unbearable. He yearns for the ideal world so that he may not need deal with this worldly heaviness and responsibility. He is what Nietzsche calls the Erhabenen in Zarathustra, those who are sublated over and above this world. And it's actually not that dissimilar to Hegel and Hegel's critique of irony, the Schelling brothers, who to Hegel behave divine-like and think of themselves as beyond the worries of man, of the everyday, and hence become detached. Nietzsche, however, calls our world in Zarathustra die Leichte, the light, the non-heavy world. And he does this in defense against the ever-tempting spirit of gravity, of heaviness, der Geist der Schwere, which hinders to him, according to Nietzsche, which hinders the human being from truly living in this worldly world and pulls the human being down and away whenever we want to act. Perhaps Goethe's Mephistopheles comes to mind here. I am the spirit that denies. And Kierkegaard also demands us to act so that we are able to step out of the dwelling in the sphere of mere ideas, in the ideal. The aesthete A in either or nonetheless wants to remain there. The world is a burden to him. The world is despicable. His reaction is to escape, to elude is distraction. Our time is full of distractions. Great parts of the modern economy produce nothing but distraction. We have an economy of distraction. The fear of the possibility of an eternal recurrence of the same, understood as boredom, becomes even more ironic when we think of the endless same nonsense, reproduced and reproduced all over. And as we are now pushed against this black wall of the future, the retromania is now really coming to the fore. In the Diapsalmata, another text by Kierkegaard, A specifically complains about the boredom of the ever-recurring same of the everyday life. Johannes the seducer then looks for the interesting, the ever-new. He is neugierig, as the German vernacular says, for curious, which literally means greedy for that which is new. Gierig, a real greed for the new. But the interesting is the always already negligible. He's looking for the ever new interesting. As Heidegger says somewhere, what interest really means is that which we are properly with and in between. But today, interesting, interessant, means that it's already negligible. The minute it becomes interesting, you've actually put it aside. It's indifferent. When we say something is interesting, it's actually, the agreement is, let's not further talk about it, it's indifferent. It's interesting just for a very brief moment, for a blink of an eye. Nietzsche describes, hence in the posthumous notebooks, the future European human being as excessively interested and neugierig, but also as weak-willed and pampered. He understands modern man as epidermally interested, so it all just touches our skin but never goes inside us. Kierkegaard's Estet A moans about the Sinnverlust, the loss of meaning he sees in the always the same. So he is out. He wants to be affected by what is interesting and new. Routine, of course, the routine of the uncanny wheelwork is lamentable. But routine is not what Nietzsche has in mind with the eternal recurrence. Nor does he understand the eternal recurrence as a scientific explanation. Nietzsche was neither a straight follower, of course, of these movements. All that he attempts to explain in the eternal recurrence of the same is a new way of thinking, of time, in this our time. Insofar as to understand the routine of the uncanny wheelwork of reproduction, and in the sense of Benjamin's reproduction of the artwork, for example, replicability, the production and reproduction of simulacra, all of this can be thought through the eternal recurrence of the same. And at the same time, the eternal recurrence of the same on the most fundamental level, on its most important level, is the new heaviest weight for existence, rather than becoming a free-floating subject that floats away into a void, a cosmos without a God. A philosophy now that cares about the following questions: meaning, where is it? What's the purpose? What gives weight to being? Will anything recur? Can there be utter loss? And if so, where does it go? Kierkegaard dealt with the thought of repetition, which is easily confusable with recurrence. Wiederkehr is not Wiederholung. And it's ironic because the story, in the story of his trip to Berlin, he did this exactly the same as he did done last time, yet nothing turned out as before. The identical does not happen again. The historical world does neither recur nor repeat. Common sense then would win this round. This is Kierkegaard's experiment. And hence we need to think the eternal recurrence of the same differently. We need to think it following Nietzsche's thoughts. It is important to note here that the eternal recurrence of the same in German is, I say it again, die ewige Wiederkehr des Gleichen. Das Gleiche, however, is not the identical, or the same actually, not even that. Nietzsche leaves there some space for, some room for development. And I'll say this again, maybe a better translation is the eternal recurrence of the like, as Ivo de Gennaro has suggested. So that there is a recurrence of the similar, but within that similar there is room for development and evolvement. Now the main difference between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, between Wiederholung and Wiederkehr, between repetition and recurrence, I would think perhaps is this. Kierkegaard, or let's just say the main difference between the two thinkers, not just these two notions, is the following. They both, of course, suffer the loss of meaning. But Kierkegaard tries to counter the loss of meaning, the dawning nihilism, with an irony to some degree, and also with a new Christianity, with a reformed Christianity that attempts to shove away the groundlessness. Whereas Nietzsche demands something a bit more difficult, which is to completely stride through nihilism. To no longer try to resist nihilism, no longer try to fight or neglect it. The multiplicity and restlessness of modern times are noticeable symptoms of an incomplete nihilism to Nietzsche. This is what he says in the Nachlass, in the posthumously published notes, of a neglected nihilism, which is done away with by an acceleration of life, by setting up monstrous mechanisms of distraction and evaluation in which all can repeat. And by evaluating, it can be repeated in a more optimized way. And only if everything is always continuously repeated and remaining the exact same, only then, in this frozen timelessness of temporality, can at all this kind of evaluation by which this entire planet now runs be performed. These are timeless judgments about something that's supposed to be frozen. When we judge or evaluate, not a proper judgment, evaluate 4 out of 5, 3 out of 5, for example, with teachers. This teacher is 9 out of 10, and he's 7 out of 10 because I got a good mark. The incomplete nihilism. This is Nietzsche. Quote, the incomplete nihilism, its forms, we are living right in the middle of it. Trying to escape nihilism will bring the opposite. It will intensify the problem. So what is nihilism for Nietzsche? And by the way, the course will really focus on nihilism, striding through nihilism, the eternal recurrence of the same, and overcoming nihilism. Nietzsche can no longer understand nihilism as caused by social crisis or corruption in the morality of the populace. Nihilism, rather, to him, is the unwelcome guest, the most unhomely guest of Europe, as he calls him in the Nachlass, and as such has always been there, and will by no means leave, and by no means be expelled. That is why Nietzsche calls the natural sciences nihilistic. They must be, as they have emerged from out of the European history of thought. Christian morality and the Platonic ideal world were but good defenders against nihilism. Yet they have been devalued. Their hereafter has never been the true world. This development reveals itself now in the merciless Sinnverlust, loss of meaning, the void described by so many, and the endless attempts and failures of meaning creation by the individual, keeping the transvalued values up, holding them as true, will only increase the power of nihilism. The moral hypothesis gave man an absolute value, as Nietzsche says. Moral was, a quote from Nietzsche, the great remedy against practical and theoretical nihilism. It gave man some weight in life and value. And Simon Critchley, sees the outbreak of incomplete nihilism today in the radicalization and fundamentalism in religion and quasi-religious movements. And there is an entire abandoning, of course, of hope. So the outrage that sometimes comes up, and in whatever facets that comes up, that's the extreme reactions, and they are reactions. They are just a sign of nihilism. There is, I would like to say also in Kierkegaard something. Kierkegaard says that if the individual believes that it can create meaning, then it fools itself. The individual that creates meaning for itself can just as well just throw away that meaning the next day. So it's not at all clear that we can just create meaning for ourselves. And of course the scientism, right, the belief in the modern sciences as more than just a methodology, but scientism is the assumption that the findings of the disciplines of the sciences are not just results of proving a certain hypothesis, but actually are truth itself. For example, let's just say something very, very bluntly. If a certain discipline focuses on chance and coincidence and contingency, Zufälligkeit, that's not an explanation. To say it was all just chance is not an explanation. To say it was just contingency, that something happened, like, I don't know, perhaps a Big Bang or evolution, that's not an explanation. Anyone can say, oh, it just happened. But saying this is, of course, usually leads to extreme outrage. And that outrage is very, very telling. Very telling. And, of course, these rather non-sophisticated explanations are just another means of trying to keep nihilism at bay. Because they give us something to hold on to. We're all cavemen, and therefore we do this. Just forgetting thousands of years of cultural history and philosophy, etc. Or to quote Nietzsche just here, that's where the desert really grows. Now, before we get even deeper into Nietzsche's thought, we must be careful here. Oftentimes, another usual reaction to Nietzsche's thought, such as the Eternal Recurrence and the striding through nihilism, is to refer to the Stoics, or the Stoicism, which is so fashionable again today. In common understanding, the Stoics, and this is simplifying it, I know, accepted life as it is. Yet, as Schopenhauer describes it quite splendidly, they longed for a life of bliss, of calm, and without suffering. Schopenhauer, however, understands that life without suffering is a contradictio ad idecto. It's a contradiction in itself. This is section 17 in The World as Will and Representation. As is well known, Schopenhauer goes so far as to say, in misquoting from the Buddhist's, life is suffering. As the will with a capital W can never be satisfied, man will always suffer. Nietzsche, however, does not directly go either the Stoics nor Schopenhauer's path. Nietzsche is grateful to his Martinet, as he calls Schopenhauer, but he goes well beyond him. Nietzsche turns away from Schopenhauer's great no to life, his depreciation of life and the world. He says in a posthumously published note, quote, "The total value of the world cannot be devalued. To the contrary, he demands a Dionysian yes to life and the world by and through the eternal recurrence. When the Dionysian yes is understood, one finds why Nietzsche does not follow the Stoics nor Schopenhauer. Life is neither just suffering nor possible without suffering, which would be the Stoics' way. Life as it is contains or is suffering as much as joy. Life is not devalued through suffering or by suffering. Thus a transvaluation of values has become necessary because the old values now threaten life affirmation. They are life denying. Values, for example, as the carefree life without suffering in the hereafter, or the carefree life on this earth. Because these two, both of them, devalue the suffering in the here and now. On the other hand, the Stoic sage, the Stoic ideal of man, does not suffer at all. He is deaf and blind to suffering. That's how Nietzsche understands the Stoics. Nietzsche has quite another kind of human being in mind, the Helsionic Man, which is another name for the Übermensch. And this is someone who stands in suffering, accepting illness and pain as absolutely necessary and inevitable. This is a human being who in calm awaits the coming storms, as from the law of the eternal recurrence of the same, as by the law of the eternal recurrence, the storms will already have passed. The Halcyon or Halcyon way of thinking accepts nihilism and strides through it. It is the calmness that arises from overcoming the most dreadful and unfavorable. It is a great yes to life, with all the suffering and joy. It is beginning to take Nietzsche's word simply as written in stone, of course, as prophecy. That is easy with a writer like Nietzsche, and his own language can tempt one to do so. But the art lies in a proper understanding of the metaphors. We need also to see where Nietzsche leads us. Nietzsche tells us that he is writing about the history of the next 200 years. He describes what is coming, what cannot be stopped any longer. And that is the dawn of nihilism, utterly and necessarily so. Which leaves us no choice, he thinks, again, to stride through it. Of course, Nietzsche was not an oracle. And the 200 years was really not meant as an exactly calculated prediction from 1886, when he says this, to 2086. He much rather tries to give an idea of what is going, or what will happen in the world as he saw it. And that it is for 2 centuries could perhaps be an indication that he sees this movement as the last of modernity. When you see when he says this at the end of the 19th century, that he would give it that much more time. And that this would still be very much our time that we have to live through. And it was Giorgio Colli who actually says this, that Nietzsche is so crucial because his problems are the problems of our time. And the crisis of Sinnverlust, Sinnlosigkeit, of the loss of meaning, of the loss of sense, of lack of sense, if there even can be a lack of sense, because sense is not something that's an object. So there's not really a lack. But there is this sense that something, in quotation marks, has shifted, has evaporated. And this perhaps gives you an idea what this meant by striding through nihilism. If nihilism has to do with the nothing, it means to accept and be able to think nothingness. Now, and of course, here's the funny thing, the ironic thing, is that nihilism or meaninglessness is now everywhere. It's in pop culture. It's something that can be marketed and sold. One of the best examples is the band Nirvana, and I have a talk on one of the first lectures I published on this channel is on the horror vacui, on boredom, and one of the examples I give is Nirvana when they come out in the early 90s and scream rather, here we are now, entertain us. It smells like teen spirit. It smells like utter boredom. Here we are, you have to entertain us. That became a marketable brand. And it's, of course, perhaps quite telling that the band is called Nirvana. So, but the uncanny wheelwork, quite obviously, that cannot stop. It cannot stop to market even meaninglessness, and create an atmosphere around it that suggests that there is something here, right? There could be perhaps entire movements or entire sort of promises surrounding how to overcome nihilism, or how to awaken from nihilism, or how to say yes to life. And these are the 5 bullet points. And by my life, my Nietzschean life affirmation, by my Stoic philosophy book, how to be an emperor, a Stoic emperor, or whatever the title is, and just ride through it. And but it shows itself as completely empty. Why? Because it actually does not at all take seriously this sudden, or maybe not so sudden, evaporation and disappearance of meaning, and that it is not just something that can be rearranged and just repackaged, and then we give it to everyone and all will be fine and good and healed again. No, Nietzsche describes this as an utterly painful, horrible, horrifying, terrifying epoch. And the amor fati does not mean that I run around and scream how great everything is because I just approve of everything, because it's just so fantastic. It means to accept even the absolute worst horrors, and not just accept them, but affirm them as absolutely necessary. That's why Nietzsche is so painful to read when you actually try and read him. It does not mean to just say, it's wonderful that this is happening, just like Dr. Pangloss runs around in the streets and affirms everything, rationalizes everything. Nietzsche asks us to really gaze at the horror of existence. And there are great horrors. You don't have to spell them out. And still be capable, without turning away, to say and affirm yes. And that's where it gets painful and horrifying. And that's where the pop cultural Nietzsche that's been going around, that's never mentioned. Never. Or the stuff on meaning crisis, etc. Awakening means to awaken to this horror and still be able to say yes, not some warm, fuzzy feeling of meaning that's coming over me. So Nietzsche's thinking is not one then which helps us to solve problems or overcome anything in any easy way. It is not one that makes ideas interesting or discussable or even accessible to everyone. No. It gives hints. Hints at the horrors of existence. And they also serve, of course, merely as points of departure. Nietzsche's thoughts provide by no means a model. His is not a theory that helps us to first analyze and then neatly overcome our problems. It rather wants us to remove us from these problems by gazing beyond time. But by gazing beyond time, by really still looking at the horrors beneath it. It is crucial to realize that Nietzsche's thinking cannot solve any problems, just like no philosopher will ever solve any of your life problems. That's what gurus do. And quite the opposite, Nietzsche is a true and genuine problem for us, a cliff against which we burst. And in that sense, his thinking is a prelude, as he says, of the philosophy of the future. Now, the doctrine of the eternal recurrence of the same is not to be explained, I'll just say the eternal recurrence of the like cannot be explained by the natural sciences. It's a philosophical question. That the method, because that's what the sciences are, they're methods. They do not apply here. The natural sciences for Nietzsche very clearly do not deliver at all laws that explain the world, but formula and tools and means by which the world could be controlled. Nietzsche understands that scientists believe in a stable world of being. They're all metaphysicians. The world of atoms, for example, is a metaphysical assumption. Quote from Nietzsche, "There is nothing stable in chemistry, however. We have imported the stable, that means being, from metaphysics." Monsieur physiciste, he says in French. This is, if anyone has the Nietzsche Gesamtausgabe in German, this is in volume 13 on page 373, 374. The Eternal Recurrence doctrine asks for the essence of becoming. Of becoming because something, being, etwas Seiendes, something that is, shall not be allowed at all. With something stable in this metaphysical sense of being, becoming, quote from Nietzsche, loses its value and appears completely meaningless and unnecessary. So think of this again. What Nietzsche says is that the sciences, by falling back into a metaphysics of stability and permanence, they actually denigrate these methods, this metaphysics, anything that's becoming, as meaningless and unnecessary. So a scientific time is inherently nihilistic. And everything just slips through its hands, so it needs more power to hold on to something, and then more power to hold on to that, and more power. And of course, with the logic of the understanding, to speak with Hegel, the Verstandeslogik, this cannot be, or formal logic, this cannot be proven either. Neither formal logical thinking nor scientific methodology, not common sense, we don't even need to mention, can help us understand this doctrine. And in the time where, according to Nietzsche, transfer elevation of all values is necessary, the rules of logic, I think, can no longer apply. The principle of non-contradiction is no longer valid, as it is itself an overcome value. Quote from Nietzsche again from the posthumously published notes. This is volume 12, page 391. Logic is the attempt to understand the world according to a concept of being, permanent being, metaphysical being, set by us, to be precise, an attempt to make the world formable, calculable. Another quote, From Nietzsche, the principle of contradiction is thus not a criterion of truth, but an imperative on that which shall count as true. Which is something that Plato says, not verbatim, but Plato does say, any hypothesis cannot be proven by the sciences. He says this in the 6th book of the Republic, and I talk about this in my podcast with Chris on the Plato's Politeia. So in dialogue with Nietzsche as we are now, Nietzsche's own words, let's see where it has led us. As Nietzsche understands his thinking, it is one that, as the introductory quote indicated, that constantly withdraws itself from our understanding, which is due to Nietzsche's attitude to totally be outside already of his time, in and outside. Nietzsche did not only criticize his time as if he was a cultural critic, he completely turned against it. He wanted to become a problem of his time and beyond, problem again in the original meaning, a riddle that already bears within itself its way of getting over it, but from within, but also then a cliff against which we are thrown. And this is why he's authoritative. He wants to be. He needs to be. He needs to be gotten over, overturned. His thinking is a constant. It's a constant nagging against some sort of all too superficial or simplistic harmony. For Giorgio Colli, the editor of the Gesamtausgabe, this is the reason for the nearly pathological interest, as Colli says, in Nietzsche in our times. Nietzsche is everywhere. There's a reason for this. In the end, Nietzsche understands himself as, quote, the last disciple of the philosopher Dionysus, the prophet of the eternal recurrence. This is why, this is end of quote, this is why we are allowed to speak of a doctrine in the first place, because Nietzsche actually speaks of it as well, and a doctrine that introduces, quote from Nietzsche, again from the Nachlass, the tragic age, doctrine of the eternal recurrence. That's a quote from Nietzsche. Incipit tragödia, that's what it reminds us of. Tragedy enters existence. And the Greeks overcame or got over and lived with pessimism thanks to tragedy. The necessary tragedy today is the full acceptance of everything life and the horrors of existence mean and hold for us. The dictum God is dead holds true. Nothing above can bring redemption or salvation. There is no God that could, in that sense, interfere. Quite the opposite. Everything recurs forever. Again, Nietzsche's recurrence of the like is not the recurrence of the identical. The things return, but there is a certain ecstatic movement to it. Every decision recurs in every other moment. Everything must recur when the world is out of joint with the death of God, for there to be responsibility of action. Nietzsche is, to some degree, he's about responsibility, and then in some other passages he's not. He's about absolute innocence, but this absolute innocence and this pure becoming, which he writes about in Twilight of the Idols, for example, is for him about bringing forth the innocence of a new beginning, to lift us from the weight of history in the strangest way, from the heaviness of history, and at the same time he introduces the heaviness of the eternal recurrence of the same. So you see how Nietzsche himself is, you can say it's contradictory, but how he is struggling through, trying to find, to get over and beyond and find the bridge towards another beginning and the innocence of a new beginning, to speak with Nietzsche, not with Heidegger. And then at the same time to still allow for a responsibility. And that's what we find in the Eternal Recurrence of the Same. Now, in such a fear, there can be a fear of the eternal recurrence of the same, and for Nietzsche that would mean not to be able to say yes to life, because one would have to be able to say yes to everything that occurs, and it's a strong pessimism, I think, as he at some point calls it. And there are aspects of life that have been denied, Nietzsche thinks, in Christianity. For example, the sex drive. And that's now no longer just understood as necessary, but actually as desirable. And it's interesting just to mention this briefly. Milan Kundera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, at the beginning of the novel, it's not the most profound novel ever written, but it is just very obviously a denial of the eternal recurrence of the same in Nietzsche, precisely because it would mean an unbearable responsibility. And the narrator of that story wants to float in existence. But to Nietzsche that would mean not a yes to life, but a yes to carelessness and imprudence. And Nietzsche is not at all about that at all. And here the desert grows in Milan Kundera. Because in this utter lightness, there is again this attempt to float away and be erhaben, to be sublated, ironic about the world, and that does not found a new beginning. And bearable is, of course, only what has a weight. And the world is not unbearable for Nietzsche, but leicht. It is bearable in that sense. The world can be carried, but it has a weight to it. Life has a weight to it, and therefore it's bearable. And by the law of the eternal recurrence, every decision counts. Every day counts, to speak. But, that means, however, that it's not just arbitrary choices, but that the decision is a judgment that really divides, an Urteil in German. So that's an original part, but also a parting, Urteil, where something other begins and divides. So it splits and parts and divides and then comes together again, perhaps. But every time a decision is made, an Urteil gefällt, das Fallbeil, something else occurs. And that law, if one lives by it, according to Nietzsche, then there is a trust in the world, because there's a trust in one's own decisions. And maybe what Nietzsche fears the most is that the human being abolishes, that human beings abolish themselves. That there will no longer be human being in this world, because we become so numb and bored and want salvation from suffering, and then we choose to become cyborgs, perhaps. But Nietzsche writes the following: Existence as it is, and this is again in the posthumously published notes, existence as it is without meaning or purpose, but inevitably recurring without a finale into the nothing. The eternal recurrence. This is the most extreme form of nihilism. Nothing, das Nichts, das Sinnlose, forever. We deny a final goal. Had existence won, then it would already have been reached. Nothing less than is what Nietzsche demands from us. Everything else would be just the unbearable lightness of being. Nietzsche wants the bearable heaviness of being, of becoming. He wants to understand the becoming of the world as justified. And yet the difficulty is that language is useless to express the becoming. Quote from Nietzsche, imprinting on becoming the character of being. That is the highest will to power. And this is, again, it's here where we see Nietzsche's own struggle with this collapse of metaphysics, and at the same time the collapse of metaphysics into the sciences, which have become metaphysical operations to generate stability in where for Nietzsche there couldn't be a perfect stability and permanence, a timeless permanence. Now, even though he says this is the highest form of nihilism, we will in the course explore further why this is deeply nihilistic, and in what sense this nihilism is one of overcoming too. Nothing here is in vain. That's what should be noted. Nothing here is ever wasted. There is no spirit of vengeance, of revenge against time here, because nothing is ever lost in the eternal recurrence of the like. The Dionysian yes, voiced in the world that follows the law of the eternal recurrence of the like, overcomes the spirit of revenge, in Geist der Rache, and the spirit of gravity. The spirit of revenge, when it thinks back, sees the suffering and wants to deny it, wants to punish time for its wars, for the past, because that's what the will cannot hold on to, and denies becoming. This is all in Zarathustra. In collaboration with the spirit of gravity, the spirit of revenge pulls down and destroys, demands the endless lamenting about missed opportunities, and calls for more revenge for the sake of revenge, for paying debts, etc. Nietzsche wants us to be freed from these nefarious demons, and hence his words are so brutal sometimes, and to release us from vengeance. Here's a longer quote from volume 11. This, my Dionysian world of the eternally self-creating, the eternally self-destroying, this mystery world of the twofold voluptuous delight, my beyond good and evil, without goal unless the joy of the circle is itself a goal, without will unless a ring feels good, will toward itself. Do you want a name for this world? A solution for all its riddles? A light for you too? You best concealed, strongest, most intrepid, most midnightly men? This world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power, and nothing besides. So this is just perhaps to point out very importantly that the will to power in Nietzsche is important, is serious, and he did want to write the will to power. There have been, as you know, attempts to deny that this is important in Nietzsche, but that would mean to set aside 10 years of his life as unimportant, and the many attempts in the notebooks to start this book and to bring it about and bring it out. But anyways, that would be, though, the greatest way to live like that. Nietzsche himself may have become may have been maybe a victim of his own thinking. The new noon, however, of which he often speaks, or new dawn sometimes, but also, of course, a new midnight, is a time to break free from overcome values. And again, a heavy weight must be placed on the world. Quote from Nietzsche: "If we put the greatest weight of life not into life, but into the hereafter, into nothing, das Nichts, then we have taken away the heavy weight from life," he says. The heavy thought of the eternal recurrence of the like shall never mean an objection to life, but an eternal yes to all things, as he says. This all is found in his notion of Dionysian, of the Dionysian world, and in the eternal recurrence of the like. Whoever wishes to can hear people say that everything is meaningless. And of course, we've also seen sects that demand that human life should end on the earth. And that would be a bit bewildering to Nietzsche. And so maybe with Zarathustra, we tell these life deniers the following, as Nietzsche at Zarathustra says: "This lesson in parting, my friend, where one can no longer love, there one should pass by and move on." And whoever wants to leave this world or radically change it has no love for the world and becomes destructive. But Nietzsche here, in a note, speaks of a new world conception. The world is one that becomes and vanishes, he says, but one that at the same time has never begun to become and has never ceased to do so. It lives by itself, out of itself. Therefore, the assumption of a created world shall not be of concern at any time. The word create is nothing but an empty figure today. And recently, Nietzsche writes, it has been tried to logically explain a beginning of the world. The reasons were of theological nature. The new world conception is one of the eternal recurrence, with the necessary transvaluation of all values, weirdly enough. A regression, Nietzsche writes, a return to the overcome values and ideals in whichever way is not at all possible. Well, of course it's possible, but it's unbecoming. And let me just maybe say, to finish this, Nietzsche is struggling through nihilism himself, and he's trying to find a new world conception. What exactly that looks like is for some other time to discuss, but there's a quote in the Zarathustra where he says, "Not only reason, but also its madness of millennia is breaking out within us. It's dangerous to be an heir." And another quote, "So far into the future did I fly, dread fell upon me." If we take it seriously, then Nietzsche does see two things. The situation in which we are historically is one in which we are pushing against a future that is no longer ours, no longer even human. And what's breaking out within us is the inevitable irrationality. This is exactly why Heidegger wants to get away from reason. Is the dark shadow of reason is breaking out within us, and not just of a few years, but of millennia. At the same time, then, a new beginning becomes necessary. One, however, that does not purely forget where everything comes from, this way of thinking, but one that sees a new beginning in the old. For if not, then dread will fall upon anyone who gazes into the future and what it holds. And then by the law of the eternal recurrence of the like, that will be true, and it will have been true forever. If, however, there is a different decision, or manifold different decisions, then that will have been, and it will have been that forever too. So again, thank you very much for listening and thinking along, as always. I would encourage you to sign up for the course if you're interested in Nietzsche and the philosophy of the future and what that might look like, to come up with it, to articulate it together. And yes, as always, thanks very much and keep well.